And now I'm very happy to pass the mic and this duty to Nanna Heidenreich, a colleague here, professor of the Transcultural Studies, to introduce the next panel.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I don't think it's relevant, but I'll still let you know this part in case you want to leave the room. This section is being streamed, so you can also join on screen. So welcome to the audience and the people online. This afternoon session will have two speakers, Taylor Lemel, who will present low battery flow, and Marwa Arsanios, who's reading Marina Vishmidt in Beirut, a conversation that did not happen, yet had happened long ago. I will begin by introducing them both, and then we will have, then they will present, and then we will have a joint discussion after both of their presentations here together. Please do. So Taylor Lemel began as a curator of film and of performance, and then began again as a writer of anti-modern art criticism and off-kilter catalog essays. She's now transitioning into writing artistic subgenres of fiction and verse. Her methodologies are archival research, herbalism, somatic bodywork, drawing, automatic writing, and dream journaling. She was an editor from 2015 to 2020 of speculative fiction and poetry for London-based independent press PSS, which includes Orion J. Facey's sci-fi fantasy novel, The Virosexuals, which I read and I was like, oh, that goes on my reading list. And is a founding co-director of London-based Not Nowhere, an analog film cooperative whose primary occupation is with building infrastructure for filmmakers to produce and circulate absolute moving image formats. Taylor has also been teaching here at Angewandte, I think, a year ago, and I'm so very sorry that we didn't meet, but I'm happy we do now. And the course had a phenomenal title, Semiotics of a Precarious Artist in Winter. Yeah. Locating it in seasonally. Yeah. Welcome, Taylor Lemel. The next speaker is Marwa Arsanios, who's sitting here. She's a researcher, writer, and an artist, and a filmmaker. She was born in Beirut and has lived in London, the Netherlands, and Berlin, where I think you're still based. And she holds a PhD here from Vienna, from the Academy of Fine Arts. As a curator, or me as a curator, I had the great pleasure of showing works of hers at the Berlin Film Festival in 2010 and 2015. And then being, happily after that, just being a happy viewer and learning from her work a great deal. From her writing, as I said, she's a researcher and a filmmaker. So she also published extensively. And from her writing, I would like to mention two texts, or actually several, but two instances. The 2023 article, Who's Afraid of Ideology? Ecofeminist Practices Between Internationalism and Globalism, published at Eflux. And then with a special emphasis, the series of conversations she commissioned, again for Eflux, from 2020 to 2022, what we talk about when we talk about crisis, a conversation in two parts, between her, Yazan Khalili, and Lara Khaldi, and where she invited them to think collectively about the formation of the category of contemporary art, its discourses, and its institutions in relation to the neoliberal economy that came with the 1990s reconstruction project in Beirut. Two conversations that, to me, resonate thoroughly with Natasha Sadragian's dusty reading earlier, and the ruins of contemporary art, especially its structural embodiment in the institution. Not least because these two conversations are also about Palestine. So welcome also, Marwa. So great to have you here. And now I give the mic and the space to Taylor.
All right. My PowerPoint apparently did not want to be seen. So, okay. First, I just want to give some appreciation to Sophia and to Roseanne. It was really nice to meet you both finally in person. I want to also give some appreciation to Annetta, who hosted me last year here. Almost a year to the day in Marina's absence, I came and did a seminar in the art theory department and was also here on Halloween. And in my spare time, I was doodling in Annetta's studio. And that was very fun. And I also want to give some appreciation for Danny for inviting us all together. I appreciate so much not only his writing, but also his ability to advance the slides and also read at the same time, which I saw yesterday. And I don't know if I can emulate that. And I wanted to, this is a group of watermelons in a cool box, in an old school cool box at a place called Barcelo Gardens in the lower 9th Ward in New Orleans. They were amazing. They were so huge, it was impossible to get through, even with a large group of people. Anyway, I also wanted to echo what was said last night and give my appreciations to the students for organizing against the European complicity in genocidal action against the Palestinian people. Yeah, is that all the appreciation? Okay, this is called this talk I did call Low Battery Flow because I was like a bit tired when they asked me for the title, but I think it could actually be called Bodies in Space Again. For me, Marina's influence initially was, well, about this kind of, what I said yesterday for me, which I experienced as a kind of uncovering of this supposed distinction between art and capital, which was extremely essential to me in like 2016-ish London, where I was working as a curator of film and performance, like the bio said. During which I might rush to historicize that period as like this kind of renewed wave of interest in, let's say, artists of an identified other, let's say. And there was also very weird things happening with the kind of explosion of interest in like Black study and that's relationship to art museums. And it just became like actually physically untenable for me anyway, to be working inside or have my labor be tied so closely inside that infrastructure. And I really wanted to do something about it. So with that, at that time, I left the museum and with other collaborators who were for the time, like I'm going to list a bunch of names for the tape. At that time, myself, Imran Paretta, Shanice Aretha, Adam Farah, Dominique White, and Christine Karubi were an informal group of people doing like crits on film and performance work. And then Daniela Valsgen and also Rahana Zaman joined that group, and we got a gift or transference of responsibility, however you might say, of a collection of 16 millimeter and 8 millimeter cameras and some associated editing equipment from a space called Nowhere, which had gotten those machines from the London Filmmakers Cooperative. And we entered into a legal negotiation, I'd say, with Arts Council England to initiate a process of novation, which I'm always saying to people, do you know what novation is? And they're like, no. And I'm like, well, let me tell you. Novation is like the coolest thing ever. I never went to law school, but I definitely went to novation school. And that is basically the transference of physical assets from one company to another. And what the negotiation was with the Arts Council was that the grant that Arts Council England was giving to Nowhere should be considered a physical asset and be transferred to what we then called Not Nowhere. So that worked, and we legally constituted as a workers' cooperative. At this point, Jennifer Martin and Rhea Storr were also involved. Soon after that, Sally Moussaoui came to do the kind of financial infrastructure because I can barely add. And then Samara Adai also became involved. And then, so by this time, it was around like 2021, and we moved into a space with Cinenova, which is a feminist film distribution archive, of which Marina was one of the founding working members. Okay, so that's kind of like the brief history. So within the work of the co-op, which I'm not really going to speak too much more about, I think maybe let's say the fascia of that work for me is I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out why I was doing what I believed. What I believed was politically and intellectually extremely important, but I was trying to figure out why I was still so tired. And this leads me back again to Marina, who actually amazingly, one time very early on when we moved in there, came into the space, everything was a mess. We sat and had a tea and had a conversation, and this is I think early 2023, sat and had a conversation, and we're walking outside and we see I think it's the 394 that goes over to City Road going by, and Marina's like, gotta go, and sprinted for the bus and got on the bus. Anyway, so I've spent a lot of time then, because of that work, trying to figure out, or not figure out, but I guess trying to engage in how bodies are constructed by politics, which is, as we discovered earlier in this month, in the coda to Marina's Bodies in Space essay in Radical Philosophy. And for me, this has been through mainly an interest in food, and like literally food, and physical movement and somatic work. Okay. So I think some of this is like talk-like, and maybe some of it is quite fragmented and broken down. So we'll see. Hopefully you can like change your ears, and hopefully I can change my voice. Okay. So the ability to struggle politically is materially constructed by the minerals we ingest, like through food, or consume through subcutaneous methods, for example, lotions on your skin. And also by other embodied practices like movement, for example, breath work, massage, even the sauna. This means that beyond a type of moral or ideological impetus to divest from certain entities as compulsory consumers, we also have, I believe, a responsibility to acknowledge that our consumption of certain goods that is produced by these corporate entities that we hate also effectively curtails our ability to resist them and or to survive them. Which means that rather than develop what I think is quite a pervasive shame around identifying as consumers, means that we're also free to play with what we consume, which is to say that because most of the minerals that we consume at this point in Europe and America require a transaction, both consumption as currency and consumption as ingestion are sites of play, improvisation, and experimentation. And what I've learned recently through some humbling embodied experience, and also through equally influential conversations, that, for instance, with Kirsten, is that pleasure should also be added to this. In other words, pleasure, improvisation, experimentation, and play are a material aspect in the political struggle against both financial capital and fine art, I might add. Furthermore, consumption as ingestion becomes then a very important lens through which to understand why certain instruments of financial capital, such as famine or enslaved labor or genocide, can become implicated in social arrangements where these instruments are not concretely present. I think for me, this is where Aneta's formulation yesterday of habit construction is also so important. So like, how might the transatlantic slave trade still show up in our habits? And that's a very big leap and kind of a timeline jump, which is for me is made sensible or concrete or possible, like really possible, almost inevitable, through Hortense Spiller's concept of the flesh. And also through Stella Dadzi's archival research into the nutrients that were either categorically present or categorically absent from certain diets or eating regimens in Jamaica, Grenada, Barbados under English colonial rule. And how might certain minerals and their presence or absence have an effect on perception and even on behavior? And let me see, I went past it already. Yeah, this gentleman says, movement clears cortisol from your body. Lack of rest makes your mind misread every social cue. This is kind of like a funny internet example of a person kind of making this link that I'm trying to think about here. I'm also thinking about here, for example, about, I guess I'm saying two things here. One, I'm saying if we think that we should stop drinking certain carbonated beverages, right? I think we can think about that not only from a standpoint of what those companies are invested in, but also understanding that ingesting the things that they produce, the toxicity of what they produce is directly linked and predicated on the same logics that also essentially destroy our ability to move freely, like on a very concrete level. I'm not talking about socially move freely, like, yeah. Anyway. I'm also thinking here about, for example, what lithium is prescribed to do. So another like very literal mineral prescribed as medicine. What lithium is prescribed to do and to who it's prescribed to, which of course privileges certain forms of perception as normal. But it's actually not that hierarchy as such that I'm trying to critique in that moment, though it deserves it, just not for me right now. But rather to point out that for me, very concretely, the minerals do affect our perception. Okay, and here's where it breaks down. I wrote theory courses as the Western medicine of thought/consciousness, ? Nervous system and infrastructure, the spine, relational in nature, evidence that the physical body does not end at the parameter of the skin. Presence of multiple bodies, physical body, social body, subtle body, emotional body. Disability justice studies have already shown us how, to the extent to which we are attending to our bodies has an impact on the collective. I'm going to read that again. Disability justice studies has already shown us the extent to which we are attending to our bodies has an impact on the collective. The use of tools to which we are opposed, like consumption, like wellness, an example, not the point as such, but an example. Choose not to consume sugar, not because it might make you fat, but because the fact that you have easy access to sugar in general was built on the infrastructure that is transatlantic slave trade, which I would say behaves in an asymptotic way as a place where we can make an attempt to say no to it in as many iterations as we can muster, not on the basis of morality or ideology, even, but on the material basis that consumption of these foods requires me to further implicate myself into this European infrastructure. For example, sugar encourages inflammation, which is not a moral judgment against sweetness, nor even a postulation that all inflammation is bad. But to say that unwanted or chronic inflammation is, of course, associated with many diseases, and because of this infrastructure of European design, which is built on the idea that we would all be compelled to outsource the attendance of our own body's needs to a company called hospital, then yes, I do think that trying to minimize inflammation in the body is one of the most anti-capitalist things we can do as a form of political struggle. Compelled here to participate in this terrible infrastructure. For example, ingesting toxins beyond our control. For example, being genetically predisposed, brackets, caveat, Germany, exclamation, 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 exhaustion. Can't even get into this in this country. I know we're in Austria, but whatever. Do I mind? Don't really care. For example, being genetically predisposed because of what the people who gave birth to us were made of, because of what they had to eat and endure in order to make us at all. I noticed that I had a very small bald patch at the front of my hairline. It was more like an inverted widow's peak. It has filled in. I had it since I was 17 when I sat at a high desk in a large, lofty first-year architecture studio, plucking strands of my hair at 2 a.m., feeling under pressure, effectively an imposter, and feeling a deadline. Years later, I saw a sepia photo of a woman whose last name is buried beneath mine, and she also had this reverse widow's peak bald spot thing, and I wondered, did Adele go to design school? Or did I pluck out strands of hair that already weren't there? But also stress, trapped emotions, and the nervous system, the infrastructure for our perception of what is possible and for our perception of what is threatening. For our ability to tolerate and embrace change and uncertainty, can we reframe enclosure, or rather property, as a stress response? A mechanism of control designed to mitigate a low tolerance for dealing with feelings of fear as they come up in the body, but also stress because it is unevenly distributed among the various nodes in this social order. And this is a gift I got from a, how would I say, like a defected neuroscientist turned integrative health practitioner. It's called Thought Record. It's a tool that's supposed to help you rewire your brain. Thought Record. Describe what happened right before the painful activating thought came up. What was the automatic thought that came up? Name what emotions came up and rate them on intensity from 1 to 10. What evidence do you have to support this? Go back to that automatic thought. What would it mean if this were true? Ask again. Ask again. Until you reach a core belief about what evidence you have against that thought, reframe at least 2 pieces of evidence that go against that thought, write a balanced or healing version of the original thought, rewrite your emotions, recite this healing version to yourself. Thank you, Regina Pritchett, for that contribution. Okay. At this point, the writer imagines herself, or rather desires, that we all get out of our chairs. Ideally, we would go outside. Ideally, we would make neck circles and shoulder circles and arm circles and rotate our spinning tops and hula our hips with no loop and wobble our thin tibia around the sockets of our knees and draw dainty little mandarins with the biggest toe so that our ankles do something cool, and then swirl our fingers around imaginary locks of hair or whatever version that your body can do at this moment. And soon I might not be able to do that, but I digress. Words fail me, dumb little granules. I want to say that I would rather we move, but I consented to being trapped in this format. And it's not so bad, this cage, really. And the worst and the absolute worst thing is to try to get a group of European intellectuals to participate with their whole body. I mean, really. Even the kindness of some of you are wonderful and twist my heart in unexpected and amazing ways, but on the whole, you lot are exhausting and make me want to go home to a place which is nicknamed Cancer Alley, but I stay because you twist my heart in these amazing and unexpected ways with your words I love, as I am heartbroken by their inadequacy. So I do my hip circles in the morning before I arrive, my little secret amongst myself and my other network. The one that might be superimposed on top of the network we can see, up to and including the people sitting here thinking, I would love to get up and do some hip circles right now. So tomorrow we meet at 10, okay? And maybe I'm just built a bit different. Okay, but wait. The infrastructure includes the whole room, how we meet and at what time, and the chairs we sit on, the blurb, the lighting, the emails that got us here, the food we ate. There is no outside. Without remembering who even wrote that, I'm no academic, but just a big brain. The mind is in the whole body. I left my brain at the bottom of a cold plunge pool, and it followed me out using a fine, subtle spinal. And like an inner child, it grew legs and haunted me for over a year. Last year, I was here in Vienna, haunting an invitation that Marina had extended. We had planned to drink mushrooms, which I had claimed gave me energy to write with my whole body, because I am captive in this big R romantic body, in space, and infrastructure and energy as centripetal force holding it all together. It's like equilibrium, but there are costs, and the costs are in relation to how we live, and the relaxation and the distribution of the energy. I failed, it was great, and I can relax. Merely a matter of spending life force energy. You don't get to keep friends spending life centripetally. This time, I'm sure I'm sharing energy out, and this is why everyone who survived the 80s is famous. These are the notes from our class last year in Marina's absence. The top was a discussion about why we can't get to the studio as much as we'd like. And the bottom was instructions for how to make an infusion, and then words from bodies in space that were tripping people up, words that people wanted definitions of. Okay, inheritance, like the machines. I don't know the next move. A provisional pad for the kids. The inheritance, 2 machines, industry machines, like regular capital and regular industry, like work. And it's a dead technology, and we're all prematurely dead. People. What a marriage. What a dysfunctional and wonderful marriage for which I need another word. Maybe it's the perfect word. The machines are dead, and we keep them running, and we're the only ones. Why this obsession with being unique when none of us are healthy? Just admit it. I'm trying to get to the point. The point is not that we are unique, but that we have made an inversion, or as Danny said last night, we found a dysfunction in the infrastructure and we are trying to use it for other means or ends. An inverted model. We didn't win anything if we are alive. It just means that we cannot relax yet. And right now, we have too much information stuffed to the brim with little unit modules of data to the top of a wide funnel and an impossibly small, narrow neck at the bottom, where just one or two granules scoop through at a time down this globular bowl that we call writing. No, maybe we are instead merging onto the highway. Oh, it's terrible. Oh, it's 10 a.m. and 8 lanes full of traffic are merging into one. Everyone is patient except for the most annoying cars who bob and weave through to get through out of the hustle 45 seconds sooner. And those are the stupid Peugeot 206 size thoughts that make it to the front of the line of consciousness, little impatient granular cars, self-serving, probably slowing everything else down with its insistence at getting out of the jam. And that's why everything that makes it to the page is like the least important thing about what actually needs to be said. Stuck in this traffic jam on the highway, the rest of the cars are grumbling. The infrastructure in this city is terrible. And I don't want to get tired of that word. Please, everybody here, promise to take care of it, to be mindful of how the word spends its life force energy. And what is the lifespan of words? Words are like people. They definitely do die. And that's it. Thank you. In case you can't see, maybe your eyes are as bad as mine, or your glasses are as dirty as mine. The top is the growth of the word infrastructure since the year 1800, and the bottom is the journey of the word abolition. So, Marwa.
All right. So, first of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to Danny and Roseanne for inviting me to be part of this amazing conference in memory and in celebration of Marina. It is such a challenging and great task to try to engage more in depth with Marina's infrastructural critique with everyone here. And I'm going to try to move between a few ideas and trying to connect them, so bear with me. I would also like to say that I did not get to know Marina personally. I just met her briefly on various occasions. However, her work was extremely influential and important to my practice, like it has been for innumerable people. What I will share with you today are a few thoughts and ideas that I'm trying to elaborate and think through in my own practice as an artist, educator, organizer, and someone who's interested in building infrastructures between the artistic and the pedagogical, ones grounded in land and ecological questions, which can take the form of agricultural communes, artist-run spaces, or schools. I try to think about these structures and infrastructures as spaces of struggle in and of themselves, and always part of larger political struggles. And I do use theory in a so-called experimental manner, or as my dear friend who's here would say, artistically. So do not feel offended if you hear any glitches in my theoretical playground here. I suppose this is part of the speculation process. So as I said, I did not get to know Marina personally. However, one of the few times I have met her was on March 15th, 2024, when I had a screening in Vienna at the Artist Space School, which is run by Yasmina Haddad and Andrea Lupleker. The screening was organized by Andrea Popelka, who was working at the Kunsthalle Wien with WHW at the time. At the height of the systematic campaign for silencing any speech on Palestine, and a few months into the latest Israeli genocidal war in Gaza, when it was announced to me that the screening will take place at the school space instead of the Kunsthalle, I was somehow relieved. Nevertheless, it did cross my mind that they might have had trouble programming it at Kunsthalle. One of those unimportant, important thoughts that crosses one's mind these days. Amongst the people sitting on the floor pillow in the front row that night was Marina. I had just seen her in Berlin in mid-January for a book launch of Bojana Svejic and Anna Vujanovic, Toward a Trans-Individual Self at Archive Books. For the whole 3 hours of the screening and the conversation on March 15th, I wondered what Marina thought of films that were dealing with land reappropriation, organizing the struggle for the deprivatization or communalization of land, the Masha, a Levantine form of common, communally tended land, an infrastructure of non-property or infrastructures that allow for another relationship to land. What can film do in relation to those infrastructures that were already in place? What can film add to that which exceeds film, like an organization for legally reverting a land from private property to a masha, a common? And why film? Or is it an infrastructure of its own in the way critique is one? I was eager to talk to her more about this and many other things. I wanted to talk to her more about how these infrastructures that produce non-property can possibly contaminate and flood the art economy and potentially shift or abolish the artist as entrepreneur, perhaps with a naive and optimistic sentiment. I also wanted to think through with her abolition in Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's understanding that is not a void or an absence, but a practice of organizing against an infrastructure of neglect. More specifically, in relation to the question of property, which was at the center of our discussion that evening. So how to produce the whole or the cut in the infrastructure through a practice of organizing otherwise? What about film again? I was keen for this conversation to happen on the way out. We ended up standing outside, exchanging a few words, and then vanishing. Since Marina's passing, I often think about that night and the conversation that did not happen. But in a way, it did happen long ago when I first came across her work on infrastructural critique published in the Former West Book Conference in 2016. Between Not Everything and Not Nothing, Cuts Toward Infrastructural Critique. Back then, I was still co-running a project space in Beirut called 98 Weeks that specifically thought about how to put into practice feminist politics with particular attention to social reproduction and the labor that produces the art organization, as well as the temporality of research processes, as the name indicates. That year, we were organizing a conference with Cecil Nelund on work and the reproductive labor of the institution. In the instances between our work on feminism, social reproduction, the city, its accelerated neoliberalization, and the invasion of global capital since the 90s, so between these multiple layers of reality, we received small grants from international foundations to be able to pay the running costs of the space that did open for possibilities, but also foreclosed others as we were part of the intense and accelerated gentrification of the city. We soon comprehended our economic entanglement with an international funding economy, however minimal, which does not reduce what we were doing to that, but foresees its limitations. Let me here do a little quick historical a jump cut to give a bit of a historical context. So the end of the 90s and the 2000s saw a program in the arts that was funded by the Ford Foundation for the bigger chunk, and other international foundations such as the Open Society Institute, the European Union, and more, which aim was to develop cultural and artistic institutions in the region. These were directly linked to an international US or European funding system that has a specific agenda focused on institutional building in the Middle East. The project of reinforcing the cultural scene and to a certain extent infiltrating it was in accordance with the foreign US administration's policies and politics in the Middle East, which aimed at taming any leftist resistance, Islamization in its different strands, perceived as the main line producing anti-US sentiment. Historically, the aim was also to obstruct any real communist or socialist organizing, parties, etc. That was in any case later on fizzling away and weakened at the dawn of the 90s as the brutal neoliberal bulldozer of the post-Civil War reconstruction of the post-Civil War reconstruction era attempted and did its best to crash parties, unions, and the last remains of leftist organization. Construction was the dominant soundscape of the city, and many other buildings came along. Capacity building or institutional building had a purpose and a consequence: the separation of culture from political movements. It looked like a political and economic transition, and cultural production would become part of a wider NGO economic complex, and the segment of a continued imperial hegemony in the region within its cultural diplomacy. Just to give a comparative example, up until 1982, a lot of the political art, film, music, theater, literature were funded by the PLO or the LCP, stands for the Lebanese Communist Party. So, as a matter of fact, in this new economy, culture was separated from any ongoing anti-colonial liberation movement or resistance. So at the wake of this moment of post-Soviet, post-Oslo, post-Ta'if, end of the Lebanese Civil War, anti-colonial struggle or revolutionary movements, for that matter, were tamed and pushed to the background, and often transformed into relics and discourses in the cultural sphere, or mere objects of study, which we also studied at 98 Weeks. 3 decades later, we see a completely new institutional landscape. What had started in the 90s with theater makers, artists, journalists, and others self-organizing and producing thought through their different mediums and collectively ended up in fully fledged institutions that resembled, at least on the surface or superficially, Western models of contemporary art institutions and museums. It undeniably produced a particular neoliberal institution that acts as a symptom of the economy, one that diffuses the inherent tension between arts and politics in fear of losing funders, or separates arts from politics when needed with an excuse of privileging so-called arts autonomy. So this does not reduce neither practices nor institutions to a mere product of the given economic and political contingencies. And more importantly, these were the material conditions of the moment, as many people repurposed very intelligently the means and have certainly not obeyed funders, quite the opposite. Nevertheless, the policies and economic dependencies have reorganized cultural work and disciplined the ground in a literal sense of the separation of disciplines and division of labor. And by no means I intend to fall into a reactionary, rigidified anti-imperialism that praises cultural authenticity, but wouldn't either deny the cultural erasure and erosion that these 90s liberal policies have led to. So that era and transition to a neoliberal economy did lead to a redefinition of culture, which means of production was, if we use Mahdi Amil's concept, solely tied to a colonial mode of production, facilitated by a national elite or comprador bourgeoisie, following his theoretical and philosophical articulation, separated from resistance and anti-colonial struggles. The CMP, the colonial mode of production, insists on the continuation and persistence of the colonial relations of production on a structural level after so-called independence. For Amil, liberation can only come from the working classes that organize towards a socialist revolution. This would be the only path to break with, or in Marina's word, to produce a cut in the structure of the colonial mode of production. A cut or a disjunction between the colonial and its mode of production. For Marina, and in her own words, in the general project of infrastructural critique, much of the work I have been doing over the years has been related to displacing the boundaries between production and its conditions. I'm trying to think about this displacement of boundaries through the specificity of the colonial mode of production, which is distinct from Fanon's neocolonialism or Samir Amin's dependency theory, as the continuation of the colonial relation can neither be ruptured by the subject and consciousness nor through a mere economic or cultural untying from the center or the metropole, but through class struggle that will lead to a temporal rupture in the mode of production. So perhaps, if we want to think about it from the prism of art, a reorganization of art workers would potentially produce this cut, which is a temporal movement, as Nadia Bouali writes in her paper, Mahdi Amil's Colonial Mode of Production and Politics in the Last Instance. So she says, Amil does not conceptualize the colonial mode of production in spatial terms. The CMP is not a colonized space, but is characterized primarily by its specific temporality, which is that of an embedded history. Amil proposes that the CMP is a contingency turned into necessity because of its specific historical dynamic of eternal repetition of essence in colonial societies. So I'm jumping now. He argues that the overcoming of the CMP requires an adequate understanding of the specificity of class struggle in this social formation. The periodization of history was not simply the result of movement of modes of production, but that of the result of the tempo and movement of class struggle. So for Amil, the colonial mode of production, and as Nadia says it, the colonial mode of production is resisted or fought against through the temporal movement of class struggle, and not a colonized space as such, which I will come back to in a second when I talk about property and land. Moreover, crucially for Amil, colonialism does not only shape the economy, but also organizes the intellectual field, producing what he calls the colonial intelligentsia, local elites who mediate between the global and local circuits of power. Their role is to reproduce colonial ideology in the guise of modernization, often through the appropriation of discourses of development, liberal democracy, freedom of art, etc. Thus, educational and cultural infrastructure are in and of themselves sites of struggle. And in that sense, I'm repeating, in that sense, artists and cultural workers organizing their work, refusing, resisting, speculating, repurposing, etc., is what will break down and crack down the historical and political specificities of the infrastructure of coloniality ultimately aiming for its disruption and abolition. Referring back to Ruthie Gilmore's understanding of abolition as a practice of organizing, such as the work of Grassroots Palestine, the question of funding, Iltiqa in Gaza, which space has been indeed razed to the ground. So these formations and spaces aim at an economic liberation of sorts, while keeping in mind that infrastructures of coloniality are in and of themselves unstable, in movement, prone to change, and in a constant dialectical relation to resistance struggle. So the deployment of different strategies in organizing is needed. I wonder to what extent a strategy of repurposing is still a feasible one in a post-7th of October order. As we have watched and are still watching infrastructures being razed to the ground, while people are genocided by the Zionist forces in Gaza, and land grab and wars continue in the region. And I will refrain from using terms such as scholasticide, epistemicide, ecocide, etc., but rather of a general obliteration of the most basic and necessary infrastructure for the social reproduction of life, from the kitchen to the home to the school to the hospital, as May Taha in her article, Social Reproduction as Survival and Insurgency in Gaza, develops. As we also watch the continued war on the south of Lebanon and the Bekaa targeting means of reconstruction such as bulldozer machines and aiming at prohibiting people from rebuilding, re-inhabiting their homes, their villages, working their land. Instead, we are bombarded with 3D renderings of real estate fantasies and settlers' projections of a Riviera, along projects of a duty-free economic zone in the border region of the south of Lebanon. Within this order, the cut in the colonial mode of production comes with cutting ties, withdrawing, and finding a new space from which to start organizing and building the none of the artist as entrepreneur. Like the most recent refusal of artists and artist-run spaces in Beirut and the larger region to accept funding from, for example, Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, as per their silence on the genocide, the boycott of the Goethe Institute, and other German and US foundations, or even returning already cashed grants. The persistent question is how to build in that space of the cut between the colonial and its mode of production, or more precisely, how to build this cut against the fantasized 3D real estate renderings projected on the rubble of annihilation and destruction. This infrastructure emerges from an this building of an infrastructure emerges from an obstinate and insistent relation to land against colonial land grab, and where counter speculation to the real estate fantasies take shape, insisting on a different property relation and a history of it, such as the Masha, a Levantine form of common land that disrupts financial speculation and cuts through the colonial land registrar in the depths of its bureaucracy. A cut through the seemingly naturalized and unshakable private property regime and private property law that organizes it. And the whole in the document from the French National Archives in Nantes titled Instruction on the Dismemberment of the Masha Land written by Camille Durafour, a French mandate officer who was deployed in Syria and Lebanon circa 1925, that reveals the ideological agenda which deemed the Masha, the common, an unproductive system and brought to the compulsory partitioning amongst co-owners of the Masha. So the remains of the masha' not as a practice of communally tending the land, but as a legal status for the commons, which is a status that exists in Lebanon and it's inherited from the Ottoman Land Code, is an antidote to the persistence and reproduction of the colonial mode of production. It is there, it exists in the land registrar and in the institution of private property. Not only producing a temporal rupture as per Amil, but also a spatial one as it concerns land, its parceling, and legal status. We see practices of the masha' re-emerging in the Levantine space, similar to an experiment that I have been part of, and which is one of legally transforming a land into a masha' or a common in the north of Lebanon. And once we delved into the bureaucracy of the land registrar, we ended up freezing the land and transforming it into a social waqf, which renders it non-transmittable, non-sellable, non-exchangeable, so prohibits any form of transactions. We were keen on creating a legal precedent of sorts, intervening in the gaps of the law, so to speak. A reverse move towards a history of a complex agricultural system and communal land tenure. Perhaps the masha' as a form of infrastructural critique of the colonial mode of production sitting in the land registrar and waiting to take a new shape. And it is actually shaping and re-emerging within Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, as Faik Mirai writes in his thesis, Masha' of the Periphery, collective labor and property in Palestinian liberation struggle, where he maps the different agricultural cooperatives in the West Bank and their connection to Palestinian struggle. Or the infrastructures of cooperatives and commune in the north of Syria built on public land after 2013 in the self-governed Kurdish region. So perhaps an infrastructural critique of the colonial mode of production is embedded and inherent to the land. I mean, it is present in the land registrar, so in the judiciary apparatus itself. It is another history of property that does not disappear, but re-emerges in moments when there is a breakdown in the naturalized order of the private property regime and creates a temporal and spatial rupture in the property relation, whether through the law or outside of it, through a practice of reappropriating land. So not always like through a legal strategy. Finally, I go back to the evening on March 15th, 2024, where we were already different artists, different art workers, and cultural workers in relation to the institution. We were different humans or different political animals. That evening, we were not ourselves, so to speak. We were a collapsed structure we had learned to function in and with. We were the collapsed structures of the liberal statu quo that was crumbling in all its apparatus and cultural institutions. So that conversation with Marina had started long before it did not occur that night in Vienna on March 15th, and continues towards infrastructures of insurgency and liberation from the colonial order, away from cultural diplomacy and its neoliberal order, the colonial mandate and its civilizing mission, settler colonialism and its genocide. Thank you.
Exactly. That was my first. So please talk to each other. And I don't know why I'm sitting in the middle. I tried to sit there. I almost sat on your lap. I'm so sorry, Marwa. but a little bit of slapstick might help. We have about, I guess, 25 minutes or so. Just keeping the time a little bit more, maybe. Yeah. I mean, by means of segue, I was wondering about how to connect you said you were interested in the question of how bodies are constructed by politics, and you used the plural, but I kept thinking the body as in singular. And then because you were speaking about the commons, that is a place of relation of that, I thought maybe that would be something of the plural and the singular and the one body and the many bodies, or the body, the embodiment. You said so much theory, so little embodiment. And I kept thinking how I use embodiment also as the institution, how it embodies us. But anyway, I realized I was getting lost in the numbers. But maybe that's not what you wanted to, because you were so keen on talking to Marwa. So maybe you can also sidestep what I just said.
No, I won't sidestep that. I think when Marwa was talking, it dawned on me why the bodies are related to the co-op, which is like a very kind of quotidian, maybe silly thing, which is that when we are in these, when we're implementing these mechanisms of like misusing different infrastructures and trying to collaborate and work together, I think the thing that I was starting to notice in the London context is the way in which like our ingrained habits start to reappear in the ways that we relate to each other, even as we are on a stated mission to do something different. So to like maybe to put that in your terms, like if we're trying to set up a commons, why are we still talking to each other in this very propertied way? Mm-hmm. And like how that has been I don't want to say like impossible to undo, but has become important work that is coterminous or co-constituted with whatever the stated mission is then of coming together in the first place. So that's also that for me, I think, is the connection. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question of property and commons, or why do we need law actually to set up a common or a community or a communally or an, I don't know how to call it actually, like an agricultural cooperative in this case. But I think it's very specific also to Lebanon in the sense that the common, the masha, which is beyond ownership in terms of it is not private, it is not public, it still exists as a legal category. So I think in that particular case, the legal or the judiciary could be used to sort of protect the land or like the place from to have like a legal, because that's how it is functioning. It's functioning through law. So in this particular case, I think it was really a kind of a challenge and interesting to go through the land registrar to understand the history of the law, the history of private property, and then start from the land and the question of property, and then hand it over to the community or the people that live around and that are going to use it. And of course, in this case, there was like a kind of a very specific annex or protocol of usership as well. And all of this comes from a history that's not like a far back, which is a history of, like a communally tending land. So, and a system of usership that existed within the Ottoman space and time, a system of usership that is not, that is also based on taxation. So it's not like a kind of an ideal system as such, but land was not owned in the same manner. So I think that since this ownership is still there, or this like non-ownership is still there, sitting somewhere, using it was important. So I think in other cases, for example, in the north of Syria, it was just, it is an armed resistance. So it's a completely different situation in terms of land reappropriation and how you like take back land. And so yeah, yeah.
It's and I guess in that I'm understanding maybe also the use of like legal means as like a provisionary measure to make something else happen, right? Like the use of legal means is not the end in itself. Yeah. I very much relate to that, like with this novation thing that I just kind of briefly passed through. So it also dawned on me that I could maybe explain a little bit more about what that means. Is like that the argument was essentially that because the grant that Arts Council England was giving to the previous organization in order to give workshops on the equipment, that we made a case for the fact that actually the equipment itself, like the physicality of the cameras, was actually not complete without the money needed to activate them. So then both were transferred, right? So it's like if then the cameras are being transferred, then actually that transfer cannot be complete unless you also transfer this money. But in that sense, I think this engagement with Arts Council England was always supposed to be provisional. Like it's not like, oh, it's not like, oh, it's so wonderful we got Arts Council money. I actually think it's difficult. Yeah.
I think this points also to a larger question generally, the relation of political struggle and the law, like by legal means or not, and what does the law mean? And is there, since we're talking about also relations that are formed, how can they be formed in a non-possessive or in an, how do you put that, propertied way? And the law is so much, there's very strong arguments to say the law is fundamentally tied to property. But in these moments of general fascism on the rise, fascization, that very question, there are strong arguments for saying there's the law, but in the eye of the failure of international law in the ongoing genocide. So what is that? And I think that smaller question is tied up to that big question of struggle and the law, and as much as, of course, strategic ways of getting somewhere, as you put it, a provisionary way of using legal means, it is always coming back, because and I thought you put that very beautifully, saying, in all these sort of struggles, how come that the way we talk to each other is still tied up to a propertied way? That's all you wanted to add.
I think the question of property is not that it did not exist. Yeah, it existed differently. So it's not about like getting rid of this or like abolishing in that sense, like, oh, just we don't want property, we just like, the relation between us and the land and how it's mediated amongst the group is completely unmediated. If property is a representation of the land. So I think that it's more that the property relation itself functioned differently and did not have the same the same kind of an understanding of ownership, which is actually like a financial one in that sense. So I think it's more related to land as commodity, the financialization of land, and of course, also, I'm not denying that there is a whole ideology behind it of the subject as the owner.
No, not yet.
Well, then maybe if that's okay with you, because of we'll open it to the audience, to questions or comments. And there's immediately one here. I'm trying to scan while I'm pointing at you. People with a microphone here, second row.
Hi, thank you for this great talk. I found it very illuminating that the question of land came up as the base element sustaining the capitalist mode of production, which comes back as a final frontier to get a hold of. But also I was questioning what you were saying about the necessity to talk to funders in how you apply for your work to be done, which is artistic work, but that is always voiced on the terms of the one funding. So I was interested in how far the the discussion with funders is an important part of the artistic practice and how far that can be a means of politics. The question of funding popped up. Is it also not a question of funders in a sense, and how can we demand our way of production as a minimal level of applying for funding as a political means? That's my question.
Well, I guess what's happened over the last 7 years is a few things. Is one has been many iterative attempts to not need that funding model at all, which I'm trying to stop myself from speaking on binary terms, but like the asymptote, the horizon line is to not need it at all. And then I think the compromise has been to actually try to really shift the mindset about what that relationship is like, and understanding that actually, particularly in an English context, that to be associated with us brings value to the funder over and above however much money they're going to give us, no matter what that is, right? And we deeply believe that, and we know that. And there's not really a way that I can see within our means at the moment to kind of undo that relationship. So or that dynamic, rather, that power dynamic. And so we try to I don't know. It's like I want to say we try to be really selective, but that's not really it. It's like we try to actually be of this mindset of not actually trying to prove worth or prove value, let's say. I mean, also materially speaking, we have a funder that is a cooperative society, so we're also trying to like seek funders that have aligned interests or like aligned missions. I think that we're also trying to, in our applications, not promise specific outcomes or directly say that part of what we do is actually not promising. So the specific outcome is that we're not about that, basically. So that's maybe the funder thing, but I do think more than that, actually, the desire has been to figure out how we can actually work with. So I kind of like, people a lot of times really speak about 16 millimeter technology like as if it has like personality and like personhood, right? Because of the kind of finicky nature of it and stuff like that. And I think for me that's incredibly generative, because I think we're maybe more focused on trying to understand how the contact printer can actually help us to sustain all of us, right? And like have a kind of figure out how to, again, like not well, this is another thing beyond not saying like, oh, all property is terrible. I think another kind of like ingrained shame that we've had to get over is this idea that like making money is a bad thing, or like, you have to do it, right? That's literally how it works. So I mean, I think that's been another thing too, is to figure out actually how to it's such a problem of language as well. I'm kind of like tripping over myself, because I feel like there's this way of thinking of like income generation, let's say, in collaboration with the machines themselves, maybe, and that being like again the horizon line or the desire, and the funding relationship kind of being like the sort of the acquiescence or like the provisional thing for like what we have now, but again, very much not the end goal. Yeah.
I like how that shifted towards film. Since that was also something you kept asking about, what about film, right? In your conversation that happened and did not happen with Marina. And I keep thinking of this question, because there is the cult, right, of this sort of the analog in a specific segment of filmmaking, film writing, film theory. And I remember, and my brain is too tired, but a friend, colleague, artist who wrote about an analog film workshop she attended in Cairo, where she lives, or lives partially. And and said it was very much about slowing down what she liked. So it wasn't about the material. It wasn't it's sort of an ontology of what it is, but it shifted the perspective on it because it is very, and I like how here it is tied to. I keep also thinking I should have, like it's printed on my table, I kept returning to Walter Benjamin's The Author as Producer, because not just so much because this question of production, but also because that text apparently was written in a moment where leftist groups were turning fascist. And I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I need to, but that's me. Instead of doing something, I was like, oh, I need to read some more. I wanted to add to the question about funders to bring up this question of institution again, because one of the things that keep puzzling me is how, whatever far-right organization is attacking the institutions of art, the institutions of education, therefore we defend it, and the means of how we defend it or when we defend it, the institution attacks us for defending it. So the fact that students are protesting the genocide is being punished by the institution instead of understanding that that's a form of protection. And so I'm kind of puzzled at this sort of, how that, the strategic, obviously, so I have a job in an institution and all that, like we have to somehow figure out how to be strategic about things. And yet it puzzles me why we get punished for defending something. But I'm, also super aware of the fact when I say I defend an institution that supposedly protects something that assumes it's but it's never been protective of people that aren't, I'm white, bourgeois, getting away with cis. Like it's not, it's already all, yeah. So I think this very question of that kept that open today with Natasha, and that sort of like I'm segueing, but maybe we go back to film because you made that the center of your conversation with Marina. So I'm very curious how you think the film and the filmmaker, the cinematic, or think with film, not least because that's a sort of a bonding practice from very different angles and very. I mean, Roseanne was also like you're talking also about specific locations. So maybe, Marwa.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I did make films about infrastructures, and now I'm going towards what you're doing. I'm thinking more about setting up with different people an infrastructure for film. But in the sense of a cooperative, and to think how film in that kind of a context could be produced. But it took me a while, actually, because I was thinking a lot about infrastructures through other political infrastructures. And it took me a while to, I needed to do that somehow in order to get out of an institution and think about what kind of an other infrastructure one can build. So it was a kind of a detour, actually, to think about how to build an infrastructure. Now, the question of economy and funding and all of this comes about. I mean, it's not like, yeah, we don't want money. We don't want, like, we need money. We want, like, to continue doing what we are doing. But it's more a question about, like, I mean, I'm posing it also in the context of a post-7th of October order, where there was a moment where a kind of a navigation of the institution of money, of economy, seemed okay, because the important thing was to take the money and do what you need to do and repurpose it, use it otherwise, and I'm not saying, no to this completely. I'm just saying there is, I mean, I really like I think there's been an ejection also, like the institution ejected us or some people. So I think that there is like a kind of a two-way thing also. That's what, there is a collapse, there's a two-way thing, there is like a kind of there's always like in a moment of collapse, you need to reinvent the economy. You really need to reinvent your economy. So in this kind of like a refusal coming from the institution and probably the funders as well, there we're like cornered to think about, so it is the political event that makes us do these things. It's not just like some ideal where, oh, I would love to, just like I have this idea about this amazing infrastructure. And no, it's the material conditions of the moment that actually pushes you to think about a different economy. And I think that this happened actually at several moments. For example, in 2019, there was an economic collapse in Lebanon, and institutions couldn't access anymore their money in the banks, their money that were coming from international funding, amongst others. So they had to downscale. They had to like reinvent their economy, and that's what happens. It's like, and when I talked about NGOs, it's not like a kind of a dismissal of the work that had been done. At the moment, these were the material conditions of the time, and people worked within that and did great stuff. But at the same time, I think, this is where we're at now.
I appreciate what you're saying about the material conditions, because I think, is it Who's Afraid of Ideology 1, where you're in the back seat talking to the camera, and then 3 is with the mashal, right? Or no, 4 is with the mashal. Okay, with both of those films, I feel like what we see in the film is you doing this thing of like bringing the material conditions of the film's own making into the narrative arc, right? So I appreciate you saying that. I think that's, for me, a very important aspect of that series or that group of work. Yeah.
I got the sign that we can extend 10 minutes or not. Yeah, 10 minutes for the audience, not for us, for you. Yeah, Fauna?
I think we need to think about a little bit more the history of both Cinenova and the London Filmmakers Co-op as two institutions which have had checkered histories of funding precisely because in the UK they did not want collectives. They wanted management, they wanted hierarchy, they wanted kind of liberal forms of institution and commercialization, both of which were refused at different times, but they have ended up with Cinenova running on practically no funds, and you luckily repurposing the materials of the London Filmmaker Co-op, which had a very illustrious history of doing many things. And I just wanted to say this because people might not know this in the audience because it's a very specific London story, and also that checkered histories of funding and trends in funding affect everybody, and it isn't just the current moment.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. We've been through a lot of the London Filmmakers ephemera that we've inherited, and I think there has been a real acknowledgement of the different circumstances and the different conditions that we're in. For example, London Filmmakers Co-op, when they expressly in a lot of their documents spoke about wanting and needing to operate without money, right? And that worked for a while. And I think that we just have completely different conditions, basically. I don't want to say we have completely different conditions, but we do have two very important different conditions. One is the price of land in London, price of land and property in London, and 2 is the let's say the social demographic of the people who are making up the cooperative, where we don't have anyone in the cooperative who has how can I put this in a general sense, who has a surplus of inherited wealth. Thank you. I was like, what's the concise phrase for that? A surplus of inherited. Thank you, Roseanne. Because my brain's also tired. Yes, a surplus of inherited wealth. Yeah. So that's Yeah,
Sophia, please. Here. I keep thinking of Japanese knotweed, which can take down property value.
Just as quick add-on on that, because I was also thinking between this relationship when you work in a collective or like with a group of people inside, outside of institutions or getting fundings from there and there. there are specific freedoms you have and specific burdens you also have if you don't go for the, let's say, state money, funding, and so on, because it has become so incredibly difficult to hold on this machinery of getting the funding, which at one hand, it is valid, let's say, budget for enabling a structure to have somehow sustainability. But at the same time, I want to frame it down, for example, talking on the Greek context, where we didn't have all these years, also before the debt crisis, very big and robust institutions like in Germany, in Austria, in Netherlands, in the UK, and so on and so on. So you are obliged to find other types of organizations which you have the same struggles as a collective. You have the same problems, how to, yeah? But then you have less this dilemma because the social economic situation is totally different. So you have to invent yourself. And I don't want to make a romanticization of precarity or of indebted countries and regions and so on. But then you have to invent different types of production, different relationalities, and different ways of going on sustainable without begging all the time for the carrot of the Western institutions.
I want to say one quick thing about that, about not nowhere is like about stability and about the conditions is that, and this is also I think what I mean in the talk of like, it's so great we get to do this work. We we did this thing and we got Arts Council to agree and blah blah blah, right? But actually, in the end, you can't even do this work if someone doesn't have a house right now. You know what I mean? So I think there's those conditions, and then I know we're in the context that you're talking about where there's a lot of infrastructure for arts funding, and then there's other models or other places where there's nothing and they get to do like really beautiful things and get to do things on exchange or do things at a smaller rate or a slower pace or in a more iterative way or things like this. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for both of your presentations and this conversation. It was so interesting and wonderful. I was thinking one way to think about both of your contributions together is the question of toxicity and restoring things that have been made toxic. And one thing that came to mind is that infrastructures create toxicity. So settler colonialism makes the land toxic, right? So even in indigenous efforts to rematriate land in North America, people in those struggles have to contend with the fact that the soil has been made toxic, right? Same thing in Gaza and throughout the region. And then I was thinking of this amazing point about, as someone who suffers from constant inflammation crises since I got COVID some years ago, I'm like, yeah, anti-inflammation is an anti-capitalist struggle. So I just wanted to put that out there. Maybe it's not so well formed as a question, but the idea that infrastructural critique confronts the toxicity of existing infrastructures, and maybe the commune is one sort of element in our apothecary arsenal, something like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you. Actually, my thought relates a lot to what was just said. Also, I was thinking of, because this, like both of your presentations, was this question of, the exhausted body, the exhausted land, the alienated body, the alienated land, and so on. And this, I really appreciate this question of inheriting the inherited toxicity, but at the same time, how to kind of avoid the idea of a neutral land or a kind of neutral, non-toxic body, which would be very essentialist and, violent. Yeah, and then I was kind of connecting this back to what was said in the previous panel about, and I'm just trying to find what I was thinking in text here. So and it was also mentioned, this kind of anti-psychiatric approach. And that made me think of the role that trauma has gotten in Amy O'Brien and Eman Abdelhadi's idea of the New York commune, and the role trauma has as a kind of, trauma from living during capitalism. And yeah, I was just thinking, I have more thoughts, but I was just thinking about this kind of, perhaps in terms of your presentations, this, and perhaps also a little bit in critique of what was just said, also how to avoid the neutralization of an idea of, the land and of the body, and how to kind of think through, the inherited toxicness that also is something that we inherit and love, because it's what we have. Be it land, be it the body. So perhaps if any of you would like to say something about that. And also like the toxicness is something that helps us survive, like perhaps some of us need more hormones than others, and we need to sort that problem. And it's also something we are not allowed to do. Thanks.
I want to say yes and yes.
Well, then I think that was very beautiful. Thank you so much. That was the end of.